So I want to talk forecasting, an extremely important concept. Most of you in your jobs will have to do some forecasting, finance and accounting all the time. My first job was a budgeting job at UTSA. I didn't really care for that job because there was nothing I was doing in that job I wouldn't have done exactly the same way when I was in high school. So nothing I learned in college really helped me with that job. It was pretty straightforward. If we spent $10 million on postage last year, let's make a budget of $10,500,000 this year. There wasn't like anything special to do. That was an expense budget job. But when you're forecasting the entire company, it's a little different. So for your CBA cases, you have to do some forecasting. Forecasting is tough. Most firms do forecasting. I don't know why they do forecasting, because it tends to be a pretty huge waste of money where they don't do anything. And if you want to get fired in your first job, and I'll ask them, why do y'all do forecasts? And here are the ridiculous answers they give. And the first answer they're going to give, you'll know what they're going to say first. They're going to say to assist something. To assist what? You can say assistant decision making, and that is absolutely false. I've never seen a firm make a decision based on a forecast. So how they did it at UTSA was they did a forecast. They took it to the CEO. He said, that's wrong. Income's going to be higher. So they go back and redo it. He says, no, that's wrong. And revenues have to be higher. They finally just matched what he was saying. What decisions did they make off of that forecast? Sounds like the decisions are already made, weren't they? So why were they doing a forecast? And no one knows. The other question you can ask that can get you fired, how accurate are your forecasts? And what's their answer to that? The true answer is what? They're horrible. What's the answer they're going to give you? They're going to say, no clue. So they'll at least be honest. They have no earthly idea if their forecasts are any good. And why don't they have any clue? Because they've never gone back. At UTSA, we never went back, in 2020, when they're doing 2025 forecasts. They don't in 2025 say, hey, give us our 2025 forecast 5 years ago. They never do that. So they have no clue. They don't know if they have any biases. What if their revenues are always overstated? Now, what would you want? You'd want the errors, your desire, the errors be random. Sometimes too high, sometimes too low. That would be a good forecast, right? You're never going to be perfect, but you don't want errors in the same direction every time. And that's what most firms do. Most firms have the same errors over and over again. Why don't they know they have the same errors? Because they never go back and test their forecasts to see where they're having mistakes. And so what does that mean? It just means forecasts are simply, UTSA spent millions of dollars doing forecasts. I used to have to help them with them. I had to build their bond forecast, which was a lot of work on my part. But I had to incorporate our interest rates rising or falling, what bonds are maturing, when are they maturing, what bonds are prepaying. I mean, it was pretty complicated forecast I had to build for them. But who knows if there's any accuracy in there. So why are firms doing forecasts? I'm going to try to give you a better answer than what your firm's going to say. So don't bring this up in your first week on the job, because this is really touchy, because they've got a lot of people doing this. And I'm going to argue, I'm going to be pretty extreme here. I'm going to argue it's about absolutely no value whatsoever. It has nothing to the firm's quality or their decisions or what they do. So could forecasting be valuable? And I'm going to say absolutely, forecasting can be valuable if you do it for the right reasons. I was showing my my other class, my risk management class, an article I really, really like. I won't go through the whole thing, but it's an article on forecasting. This guy, Paul, whatever his last name is, not that one. And this is a good example of how bad forecasting is. This is the forecast of the Olympics. And the Olympic forecast, so Olympics pretty important, right? You're making a forecast for Paris or Barcelona or whoever. You want the Olympics in your country. You have an incentive to make it look way too good. So how bad are they? Olympic infrastructure tends to break budgets even more than other projects. A recent working paper showed that since 1960, every Olympiad, so does that sound like there's a trend here? Not 80% of them, 100% of them have gone over budget, and by how much? On average, 180%. Is that a good forecast or a bad forecast? If you miss it by 180%, then there's a good chance you argue for something that was actually a bad decision. And I think most countries actually, I went through the Athens Olympics. I'm pretty sure Greece did not do well with that Olympics. That was a horrible financial decision. Then they talk about the Russian Olympics. So this guy's talking about why are we so bad at forecasting? And the first thing he says is people think that forecasters are make predictions. So that's the first thing you got to say. Forecasts are not predictions. All right, we're not trying to predict the future. So here he says the primary goal of forecasting, I absolutely agree with this, is to build distributions. So I'm really encouraging you in your firm, if you're accounting or finance especially, you may have to wait a few months so you don't get fired, but I do want you should upset the apple cart, as they say. If your firm is doing forecasts, they say for decisions or predictive future, I think you should change your concept to it's actually risk management. So that's my big thing. The purpose of a forecast is risk management. What if Silicon Valley had done a forecast of 2022, 2023 and run a scenario? What if interest rates rose dramatically? And then they see that, oh, we're out of business. Would that have been a useful distribution to look at? Say, oh, we got a scenario in our distribution where we're out of business. And it's not that unlikely of an event. There's a pretty good chance that would happen. If interest rates rise, we're out of business. You think their board would have liked to have heard that? That might have been useful to their decision making. To maybe manage that risk, but it's a risk management. So I believe the whole purpose for forecasting is risk management. You want the forecast not to be a point estimate, but you want it to be a distribution of what could happen in the future. So he says the purpose of a forecast is to map uncertainty. And you want to be as brutally honest as possible. So that's why you see why I'm having you do that in your CBAs, your best case and worst case. And I don't want your best case and worst case to be some narrow thing. I want it to be pretty wide. I want you to be as brutally honest as you can on where you think this company could go. And most projects, the worst case looks pretty bad. All right, so it's a good paper, good article. So a lot of forecasts are deterministic views of the future. It's a 1-point forecast. A lot of times they'll have a 2-year forecast that's more detailed, and they may have a longer-term forecast that goes out 10 years. USA started doing 7-year forecasts, and they started doing 7-year forecasts in 1993. You can kind of guess why we did that, because the CEO said, I want to see year 2000. So we went from a 5-year forecast to 7 years. And then guess what they did in 1994? They kept doing 7-year forecasts. So it kind of just stuck. And then 10 years later, people are saying, why are we doing 7-year forecasts? It's like, well, because of that 1 year, right? There's no logic to a lot of this stuff. We just start doing them. So 1-year forecast, 2-year forecast, and then usually higher level, not as detailed, out another 5-10 years. Although I have to say, not to pick on you accountants, the accountants asked me to do a 5-year forecast on my travel budget, and the IRS changed the rules on how travel meals were taxed. So they wanted me to know what I was going to spend on travel meals 5 years from now. I had no earthly idea what trips I was going to take, but I was supposed to forecast travel meals. And that's another issue to talk about. So I'm going to step on the toes of the accountants. More detail is more accurate. And is that true? My opinion, what the accountant should have done is look at what meals were as percentage of travel historically and just applied that ratio to the forecast. That's what I think they should have done. Rather than asking me, it's like, I don't even know what cities I'm going to, but yeah, maybe we'll do some trips to Chicago, who knows? I had one guy who ran the gold fund. So he worked for me, and so I needed a travel budget for him. Well, sometimes he went to South Africa to visit gold mines, sometimes he didn't. And like, when are you going to go? Well, if they're having a major strike in South Africa, I'm probably not going to go that year. So, okay, well, when is South Africa going to have major gold mine strikes? You know, you can see there's no way for me to forecast that. So I'm not so sure more accuracy, but sometimes the accounting world, they think, hey, if we drill down to more detail, we're going to get a more accurate forecast. I think what you do is just multiply the errors on top of each other. But that's something you'll have to debate when you get into these jobs. So a forecast can be bottom down or top up. So bottom down is the CEO, CFO, they say, hey, this is what we need to do. You give me a budget that matches that. A top down, you go down to the bottom, lowest rung of the company, and each person forecasts their own thing. And then you build it up. At USA, we were bottoms, we were top, I'm sorry, I did it backwards. Say that backwards. Bottom up, you start at the bottom of the firm and build it up. Top down, you start with the CEO. So at USA, we started bottom up. We got a forecast, took the CEO, and he said, that's wrong, fix it. And then we just manually fix it to match his numbers. Some people say bottom up is more accurate, or at least has more buy-in because you're getting everybody's input. Top down is, you know, at least you know what the CEO is thinking. Well, zero base is a little different. So zero base is you say, forget what you've ever done historically. We want you to justify yourself as if you never existed before. Pretend like your department didn't exist and you got approved. So, I mean, that's pretty rough forecasting, isn't it? Say, let's pretend like your department never existed. We want you to come and make a case for us to start your department this year. That's zero budgeting. So that's pretty tough. The government essentially supposedly does that. Military supposedly does, but I don't know. Well, you get real defensive, right? It's hard to say. Now, I've only had one boss. I wasn't in her department, but I was a subsidiary kind of her department. But her department, my best friend worked there, and they just had nothing to do. They were all so bored. And she did an analysis like that, zero budgeting, and she actually eliminated her own department. And I was really impressed. I thought, well, at least she was honest. She says, yeah, well, you don't need my department. That was her final conclusion, and they eliminated her department. She eliminated her own job. You probably didn't see that a lot, did you? Most people are like, no, we're the most critical thing. It'd be interesting to see the federal government do that and just say, hey, do we really need the Department of Education? What did they do? What if they didn't exist? And people get real defensive, but it's, you know, to me, it's a legitimate question to ask. What if they didn't exist? What would happen? You know, the states, the cities run their educational system. What would happen? You could probably make strong arguments either way, but at least you're taking care of the taxpayers' money. That's different than bottoms up. Bottom up is you're just going to each department, you're getting their budget. You're not asking them, should they exist? You're assuming they're going to exist. You just want to know how much they're going to spend next year. USA never did a zero kind of from scratch type of budget. They probably should have. So bottom down, top down, I mean, bottom up, top down, which more accurate? No one knows because no one ever tests this kind of stuff. We don't have any analysis. There's one firm I dealt with, very impressive firm, an actuarial firm. They would actually come in and take your forecast and run an analysis to see what your biases are. And I thought that's pretty impressive. And I thought we should have done that, but no one was interested. I don't think people were interested in it. And I think the reason they weren't interested is they didn't want to know the truth. No one wanted to know how just horribly bad we were at forecast. I think this is a big deal because firms spend a lot of money on something I think is a completely of no value whatsoever. But all right, so 3 months into your next job, don't do it in the first week. You make them really nervous, but it's like, why do we do forecasts? Or, you know, to Joshua's point, what if we stop doing forecasts? What would happen? Would this company come to an end? Would the world come to an end? Would this be the end of us? What would really change? And they'll say, well, it facilitates decision making. I don't believe that at all. It should facilitate risk management. For most firms, they only do 1 point estimate. You cannot facilitate risk management if you only have one estimate. You need to run an entire analysis. Now we did this at UTSA. It was called stochastic analysis, stochastic modeling. Have you heard of that term before? How many of y'all heard the word stochastic? What's another word for stochastic? Simulation. So I ran a stochastic model for March Madness. And I was kind of curious, you know, no one did very well this year, did they? And I gave up. I was completely uninterested once UT went out. And then suddenly I started watching the women's side because of that lady Clark. I thought, wow, it's kind of interesting. So, you know, one player can suddenly make you interested. I don't care on the men's side. I don't even remember who's on the men's side. Is it San Diego and
San Diego State University and UConn.
And who?
UConn.
UConn. Oh, that's right, UConn. UConn's probably going to win the whole thing. So I ran a stochastic model. What I did is I took the historical numbers. How often does a 1 seed lose to a 16 seed? How often does a 2 seed lose to 15? I set up an Excel. I should probably show you all this. It'd be pretty interesting. I don't have it with me, but I used the random number generator, and I just said, hey, if my random number is above 0.98, then have the 16 seed win. If it's below 0.98, have the 1 seed win. And did all the way down. I think there's one where they're actually out of order. So I think might be the 9 seed wins slightly more often than the 8 seed. So I went back, I was able to find all those numbers. That's pretty good, right? And I used those numbers and ran them. And I compared it to my record. It was pretty comparable. But I ran it over and over and over again on the actual March Madness this year. My best record was with the random was 25 and 11, I think. So I don't know, you know, I don't know who did the best out of all of the cases, but I think next year I'm actually going to use that to build my March Madness case. I'm just going to say whatever this random number does, you know, just let it do it. The reason I think that would be pretty impressive is it takes my biases out of it. So I'm much more likely to get one of those wild ones right, and then I'll look really smart. I won't tell anybody I just did it randomly with the computer. I'll say, yeah, I knew Arizona's going to lose. Yeah, I had it in my model. I've been watching them all semester, all season, and you know. But you can do that kind of thing. So if you have a distribution, you use the random number generator. Have y'all seen those books of random numbers before we had this? There's a thick book, and it's just a bunch of random numbers. People used to use that. You just open up a page, and it gives you all the numbers. So Excel does that for you. You could probably find some way to do this on your case. Your cost benefit analysis. So it's possible to do that. And so that's what we did at UTSA. We did stochastic modeling. We modeled our P&C insurance company. We modeled the life insurance company. We modeled the bank. We modeled the real estate company, investment company, and the pension plan. We modeled all of these. We did like 1,000 simulations. I provided all the simulations to say, okay, in this simulation number 47, interest rates rise, inflation stays the same, the stock market crashes. We have this many hurricanes. I didn't actually do the hurricanes, earthquakes that came from the actuaries. But we ran them, and each business ran their business. They sent their 1,000 simulations back. I put them all together, and I wanted to see how did it look. It was really quite fascinating. The first thing we figured out was most of our risk comes from the property casualty company, and we kind of knew that going in. But the biggest risk was hurricanes, earthquakes. That was the biggest risk. The other thing we learned we thought was really interesting was the life and the bank offset each other. When the bank was doing well, the life insurance company was struggling. When the bank was struggling, the life insurance, they're a really good hedge. So I said, you know, we don't need to spend a lot of money hedging that risk because they hedge each other kind of naturally. So we got a good thing there. I also found that the pension plan was a huge risk that we were actually ignoring. And if interest rates fell, that thing was going to kill us. And so we hedged that. I hedged our pension plan. And so we ended up being the only pension plan in 2008 that saw its surplus increase. Of the 1,000, there's 1,000 largest pension plans in the United States. 999 of them went from a surplus to a deficit in 2008, except for one. And that was USA. We went from $300 million surplus to a $900 million surplus. So this kind of modeling can really help you. We saw a risk that just seemed like we don't want to take that risk. We use these models for risk management, and we eliminated risk in 2008. It saved us probably $1 billion by itself. So it's really powerful. Some of your firms might do this, but you need some pretty good computer power. We did this with 3 people. USA now has a department of 70 people doing this. I saw the guy running the department. I was like, what are you guys doing? That's 70 people. I don't even know what you're doing every 5 days a week. What are they actually doing 5 days a week? So I kind of stepped on his toes, but that's stochastic modeling. That to me is the ultimate, because it actually produces a distribution of your business. Wouldn't you love to do this with your cost benefit analysis case? You could model all kinds of things and just see what's going on. So we did that at USAA, and that was to facilitate risk management. And doing that probably saved us $1.5–2 billion in 2008 by itself. It really saved us a lot. It's quite beneficial to us, because we really understood what happens if we have a major stock market crash and this kind of thing happens, and how can we hedge these risks. So facilitating risk management, what you're trying to do there is go through scenarios, understand your business. So you might say, we want to increase our prices. Well, what if our competitors do this? What's going to happen? What if they do this? How do we understand that? If we grow at these really high rates, are we going to be able to keep up with this? USA saw this. USA opened up their business to the enlisted market, and the modeling they didn't really help them that much, because they only did point forecast. What they discovered is they're growing way too fast, and they had to cut back and slow it down because they couldn't keep up with the business. It was really hurting them. So really, they could have, in that particular case, they had some really good, strong distribution analysis. They could have seen that kind of risk coming. All right, so the components of a good financial forecast: you need some economic assumptions. So 3 months into your job, if you want to really put the forecasting people in turmoil, say, y'all doing a 10-year forecast. I'm curious, what do you think the chances of a recession in the next 10 years? Oh, really high probability. Do you have a recession in your forecast? No. So you think there's going to be a recession, but you don't have one in your forecast. Does that make sense? Your forecast doesn't reflect what you actually believe. Why? Because they don't know what year to put the recession into. But you should put something. There's going to be some down year in those 10 years. There's going to be some down stock market year in those 10 years. Interest rates are going to move. So what are you going to do? What are your assumptions for inflation, for interest rates, for the overall economy, for employment, for capital markets, stock markets, bond markets, those kind of things? What are your assumptions there? So we ran all of those. We had different assumptions for each one. And my job was to at least make sure, if we're going to do point estimates, that everybody's using the same assumptions. We don't have the bank assuming interest rates are going to rise and the life insurance company assuming they're going to fall. And we're both using the same assumptions. So that was my job, to go out and get those assumptions out to everybody. We were spending thousands of dollars on these assumptions, and I found a way to do it for free. So you don't have to be fancy to do this kind of stuff. So what is your economic assumption? So some of y'all might have this issue with some of your cases. I think probably what you're going to do is, instead of having thousands of assumptions, you're probably going to say, okay, what if the economy, some of you are doing real estate. What if the economy in San Antonio is really, really strong? People keep moving here from California or wherever. The real estate market does well. Employment does well. No major employer leaves. Or let's just say it's kind of average. It keeps doing what it's been doing. Or what if USA leaves San Antonio? They closed quite a few bases in San Antonio several years ago. What is that going to do to employment? What is that going to do to real estate? If you're doing your case on real estate in a particular area of San Antonio, who's the major employer there? What happens if they leave the city? So you can get real specific on the downside related to what you think is going to happen. If your case is real estate in San Antonio, you don't need to talk about the U.S. economy. You need to focus on just San Antonio, what's going on there. All right. So be really, really specific. If you're doing a franchise that you're going to open in San Antonio, you want to think about that particular area of San Antonio. The second thing you're gonna do, which is the most important, is your sales forecast. Your sales forecast is what economy you're gonna have, where are you in your product life cycle. If you're doing a forecast for a pharmaceutical, you got to see how many more years do you have on your patent, what generics are going to come along. Those are the kind of things you're looking for. If you're doing a real estate forecast, you want to know when the lease comes up, what kind of lease improvements you're going to have to do to get the person to come back into the lease. What are your marketing plans to get that sales forecast? Are you going to do any price changes along the way? So USA had a department that did elasticity studies, a bunch of PhDs, and they would ask the question. So USA would say, wow, we're really uncompetitive in this market. We're going to need to cut our prices. And so they can say, well, if you cut your prices, you'll get this many customers back. And then the actuaries are going to say, yep, we're going to lose a lot of money. So you have all those dynamics together. What are your competitors going to do? What's your market share? What market share are you going to pick up? If you're going to pick up market share, from whom are you going to get it? Which competitors are you getting business from? And then Disruptive Innovations, I highly recommend this book, Seeing What's Next. Christensen, he unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but Clayton Christensen, really good writer, very readable, great insights. So Disruptive Innovations. Let's say you're, boy, I can't even tell you now. Y'all may not have even heard of this company before. Let's see. Have y'all heard of Blockbusters? Have y'all ever used Blockbuster? Have you really? I think I've been in one twice in my life. So it went out of business in '96. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
So let's say you're doing Blockbuster's forecast in 1993. How valuable will that forecast be? Yeah, well, if you knew they're going out of business, it'd be a really easy forecast. You just say, yeah, negative 100% in 5 years. But
Once eventually online, like 1996 wasn't online.
Yeah. And that's why that's the one thing I got out of Helmer is 7 powers.
And a bunch of key options declared.
Yeah, he actually uses Netflix as his example of his second power or third power counter positioning. We talked about this a little bit, I think, previous. I think Kodak's a good example. Kodak, I don't think there's any hope for them. Really, I don't think there's anything they could have done. But counter positioning is, you got these stores, you got these workers, you got a lot invested in that. Netflix didn't have anything like that. They had, very different. And so Blockbuster is saying, hey, if we start mailing to homes, boy, that really disrupts our current model. Can we really compete there? And they'll have to say, if we try that, we're going to mess up what we already have. And that's what counter positioning. A new company adopts a new superior business model, which the incumbent doesn't mimic due to anticipated damage. If they mimic it, it hurts their own business. And so they essentially have to say, you know what? We just have to hope they're not successful. Because if we try to mimic them, first of all, they're going to be better than us. Secondly, it's going to destroy our current business. That's the kind of thing. That's the Western Union. Why did Western Union not buy? Alexander Bell offered his invention to them. Why didn't they take it? Because it would have hurt their existing business, and they were just too profitable. So I think it's a really, really interesting insight there. The forecasting of Blockbuster, they were aware of Netflix. It wasn't like they were sitting there and not aware of it. You have to figure out what are they gonna do? How successful will they be? Obviously, they're probably talking about streaming at that time as well. Could they have been successful? Is Barnes and Noble still in business?
Yes.
There's a few of them, aren't there? But there's several that aren't, right? There's several of them. Well, do y'all go to the malls at all? Your grandparents probably do in tennis shoes, but so yeah, and Barnes and Noble has some other stuff just besides their stores. I used to love to go to bookstores. I thought it was a really fun experience. I used to buy CDs because I love music, but now, you know, I can, everything I want, I can get from iTunes. It's hard to forecast these businesses out 10 years because if you really forecasted what Blockbuster was going to happen, no one would believe that forecast, but it was the true forecast. So what is your forecast going to do for you? The best forecast would be the one saying we're going out of business. That would have been the best forecast. And then what would management do to react to that? What could you actually do? And there may be nothing to do. And then you're in a winding down type of business. And so that's what Christensen's talking about. Your business no longer makes any sense. You can do the same thing with Toys R Us, Circuit City. These are all, you know, if you're in these businesses, it's kind of interesting to go back and look at the business that failed. And should they have, what's the name of his book? Seeing What's Next. Did Blockbuster see what was next? Maybe they did, and they just say, you know what, we just gotta go out of business. The Kodak, I think Kodak saw what was next, and they just said, hey, we'll just keep it going as long as we can, because you know, what else can we do? But that's important. Valero right now, obviously Valero is talking about electronic cars, no question. If you go to Valero's annual report, and you search on the word electric cars, if I can spell electric, such as electric vehicles, a reduction in demand for our product could result from a transition from alternative fuel vehicles to alternative fuel vehicles by consumers such as electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles. I already have my hybrid. Whether a result of technological or scientific advances. Is this true? Could result? Is it a foregone conclusion that Valero is going to be smaller 10 years from now, or is there a chance EVs don't work at all and the whole thing falls apart? Brandon probably has a pretty good opinion on that, but is that a 99% chance? Or
there's a bigger chance or they get different like cells find big current capabilities that we need to have. They're not sufficient.
yeah, lithium, cobalt. I mean, there's some pretty bad places that are producing this stuff that it's, you know, so, but people say technology is going to find something else because it always does. Hopefully that's the case. What would you do if you're Valero's? What if you're the finest person forecasting Valero? What would your forecast be? How would you incorporate this in there? You know, it's interesting. We have some really good UTSA alums working for Valero, really impressive. They're hiring our students. You know, they've got some great jobs out there, but you have to be a little bit worried about this, you know, as your career. And Brandon might say he wants them to go out of business. I don't know. Do we hope we don't use any gasoline in 20 years or so?
Can't manufacture EVs.
Yeah, I've read some books where they're arguing that side of it too. It's a lot of uncertainty. It's practically impossible to forecast. But what forecast do they do? So they do a forecast of a best case. What's their best case, their worst case? Would you want to look at a worst case? And how would you build that? If I were their management, I would say, yeah, assume electric vehicles are 40% of the market in 2035. Couldn't they do that? So what percentage of vehicles will be EVs? How much did I type in there that was actually correct? What percentage will be? Do you think he's going to find something out there? How long until they roll the road? By 2035, at that point, only 13% will be electric. You know, who knows? First of all, you got to look at the source. If the source is Exxon, that may not be a reliable source. If the source is a EV producer in China, that may not be a reliable source. If it's the governor of California, they may not be a reliable Trump. If it's Trump, they may be a reliable source. So you're looking for someone who, and this is really key. I love this. One of the books I'm reading, Brandon, on global warming is a philosopher. It's a really good book. He's getting a lot of bad press. You see him all the time speaking to Congress. What I like about his book is it's very logical. I can't test his numbers and what he says, but it's very, very logical. But he has the same type of philosophy of what numbers do you look at? And the thing you want to look at on forecasts is you want someone that is harmed if their forecast is wrong. All right. Al Gore going out and saying the world's going to end if we don't do anything. He's not harmed if his forecast is wrong. Why? Because he's all in on global warming. Right. Greta, she's all in on global warming. She doesn't get penalized if her forecast is wrong. Trump, he's all in on global warming not being an issue. Right. He has an incentive to go the other direction. So these are people that if their forecast is wrong, it doesn't harm them. The key is that they just got to stick with their forecast. You want someone that if their forecast is wrong, they're harmed, they'll change their forecast. So you want someone that their incentive is to change their forecast as soon as they get better information. So their incentive is to be correct, not to win the argument. All right. And how do you find those people? And that's what he does such a great job in his book. Is this is how you know someone's forecast is flawed. You'll notice that they're ignoring the other side of this argument, whatever. So he's really good because he's a philosopher. So I like it. Brandon, you may not like his book, but I encourage you to read it because he makes the argument of how we know we got a bias in the forecast. So if I'm looking on these, when are electric, how many cars are going to be electric 20 years from now? Look at the source. What's their incentive? What happens to them if their forecast is wrong? Do they have some? I don't know how much Al Gore was making off of his side of the argument, but I'm if I regret it, I would stick with my argument no matter what. If I saw information that contradicted what I believe, I would be going, hear no evil, see no evil. Why? Because she's got kind of franchise there, right? So people having a franchise on one side of the argument, you can't trust them. Not that they're not wonderful people, but you can't trust them because of a strong bias. So who would be a good person to listen to? And that's, I don't know. In all of these sources, I don't know who would be a good person to listen to. Would Tesla be a good source to go to? Probably not.
Maybe on the manufacturing side, how the batteries being made.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard these things with the million mile battery. That's pretty exciting. Is that really true, or is that just people making stuff up?
They were able to change the cell sizes and able to replicate it at large volume, and it's something that Chevrolet
Right.
not do. So,
Yeah, that's pretty important. What someone on Facebook published is waves electricity. And I thought that's interesting. Waves making electricity. I was like, well, that sounds pretty cool. And then I looked it up, and the cost is just, according to this one site that I didn't check, I don't know if it's any good, but they were talking about the cost of doing this. It's just, yeah, it's wonderful. It's very green, but it's so expensive. We would never use it because it costs too much. The material, the stuff you have to put into the waves, there's so much manufacturing there that you'll lose it all the benefit creating that. So I'm going to actually look on my phone because I wrote his other arguments. Let me get this because I really, really like this. I want y'all to be different. So here's the things he said. I don't even know who the author is, but really good book. If any of y'all want the book, email me. I don't want to be a global warming denier, and he's not, but I don't know I don't have time to research it. I don't have a degree in environmental science, so I just read everybody. So my goal is to read. Anytime I see someone that's an expert on the other side of my argument, that's what I want to read. So I want to read whatever disagrees with what I currently say. But here's what he says. These people, they present evidence, not authority. So they don't say, hey, it's right because I said it. I think that's the Gore and Trump side of it. It's like, hey, they just give you facts, and hey, the fact that I said it means it must be right. Well, no, give me the evidence. The evidence is clearly stated and precise. They should actually be excited to give you the evidence. They're not hiding anything. They clearly state what they are unaware of. I don't know how to spell this word, but they're not all knowing. How many Facebook, I don't have Facebook friends, but let's say you're on Facebook. How many Facebook friends do you have that are omniscient? Quite a few, don't you? They start sentences with a certain idea, and they don't start with I believe, I think, in my opinion. They just say, hey, this is going to happen. He's like, how do you know that? Well, you don't believe me, just ask me. It's like, well, no, that's not good evidence. I need more evidence than that. They're not all knowing. And then they address competing arguments. So some of y'all might not like Milton Friedman. I love Milton Friedman. Not because I agree with his arguments. He's too smart for me to know if he's right or not, because he's way over my head. He's the monetarist and all that. Obviously, some of his theories have been really questioned, but he's very respectful to the people on the other side of the argument. You know, he's very anti-Keynesian, but he's very respectful toward Keynes. You know, I like people like that. That's one of the reasons I don't like Krugman. Krugman, I've read his books, but he's so insulting to the people on the other side of the argument. I don't like that. I like someone to acknowledge, hey, the other side have some good points. This is what they're saying. I can see their argument. I disagree with them for these reasons. I encourage you, go out to YouTube and watch Milton Friedman. He has these college students just screaming at him, and he's sitting there all calm, and he just takes the argument and logically tears it to shreds very politely. And the people are still screaming from the audience, but he doesn't get riled up. He just, oh, I see your argument. Let me break that down. Very interesting. That's the way I like it. People that can just, they can be calm and collected. Let's see. They don't argue against straw men. Y'all know what a straw man is? Yeah, you take the other person's argument, you misstate it in a ridiculous way, and then you badmouth how stupid they are. That's the straw man argument. I've heard people do that with some of my beliefs, like, yeah, that would be really stupid, but that's not what I believe. But yeah, so, and why did they do that? Well, it's to actually admit what we don't know and admit the other side has a point. Our egos don't like that. And that's one of the big things here is the death of the ego. It's like, I want to know what's true. I don't want to be right. I just want to know what's true. So and this one thing I love about Annie Duke, y'all should all read her book. Great book. She says, we've got to change our ego from people thinking we're right, you know, that we win all the arguments, versus our ego should be fed by us learning, by us kicking out bad arguments and bringing in new ones. If we can feed our ego with, wow, you know, I used to think that was true. Now I see it's wrong. And now I'm change it. You feed yourself that way. And that way you actually intentionally read stuff that contradict what you believe. If you looked at my Audible, you'd be shocked. I said, wow, I can't believe you're reading those books. I mean, I've got Karl Marx in here. Am I socialist, communist? No. Why do I read Karl Marx? Because I want to see what his side of the argument is. I also have, you know, the other, what's his name? Wealth of Nations. I got him in there as well. I read a book here recently by, I recommend this book as well, Howard Woodfox. And I'm thinking, I'm not going to like this book. I know his background. I know his biases. I'm not going to like this book at all. I love this book. It's so good. It gave me a whole new perspective that I've never seen before. It has nothing to do with finance, but just such a great book. So, you know, so that's how I pick books, is I'm looking for books that contradict with what I believe. But this is what forecasting is all about. You gotta admit we don't know much, and you're trying to look for evidence to give you some insight on the future. And if you're going to try to figure out, let's say this example here, percentage EVs in say 20 years, whom are you going to listen to? This is what you're looking for, these type of people that are providing, you know, good, clear evidence that's well documented. They acknowledge the other side of the argument. They're not completely kicking out, you know, they don't create straw men of the other argument. So it's a good list. I'm always, when I'm reading, I want to know what's the incentive of the person producing this. What's their underlying biases? What are they? It doesn't mean I don't listen to Greta or Al Gore or Don or Trump. I'll listen to their arguments, but it's not usually arguments. It's usually kind of, a pretty slanted one side of it. So who else can I listen to that might give me another perspective? And that's where disruptive innovations come in. You're looking for something radical. It's going to hit your company. It's going to change everything. You're not going to get that if you're reading the same stuff over and over again. You've got to get outside of your comfort zone and read some other stuff. All right, once you get the sales forecast, that's the most important. Then you got to do a capital budget. You got to figure out what machines we need, what buildings do we need. We need to expand, those type of things. Based on that sales forecast, do you need to hire new salespeople? Do you need new servers? Once you get all of that, the rest of it, the forecast is usually fairly straightforward. Expense budgets and those kind of things are usually fairly straightforward. I'm not going to show you the Walmart example, but I do want to show you a couple examples here. So here's one where we did a forecast of Facebook. Used to be Facebook, now it's Meta. So with Facebook, what we did is we got their active users. Back in 2012, that was 1 billion. When we did the forecast, it's been several years. When we did the forecast, it's 2.3 billion. We then look at their revenue per active user, and this is pretty amazing. So this is all advertising dollars. So what Meta can say is, and Google's the same way, is this is how many active people we have. Now we got 2 billion instead of 1 billion. So their advertisers are going to pay more, they can get more advertisers. So back in 2012, they're only making about $5 a year off for each active user. By 2018, that had shot up 5-fold to almost $25. And so there's the revenue, 5 billion up to 56 billion. Now we got to forecast that out. So how many users are they going to get? And what's their revenue per user going to be? Here I have, I should go out and see how good this forecast was. So 125 billion. Should I do this? Kind of scary, isn't it? Well, let's see. Y'all think it's an accurate forecast? I did it 5 years ago. I'm scared to look, but I'll look. So their revenues in 2022 was 117 billion. What did my forecast say? 125. Boy, I missed it by about 6%. Not horrendous, but it's, it's not great. But I missed it. Then the question, what would you want to know? Wouldn't you want to know which of these numbers I missed? Wouldn't that be valuable to you? Did I miss it on users or I made it revenue per users? That'd be pretty helpful to know. Now on users, how would I do this? Well, remember, when you get a job, you're going to be sitting there 50 hours a week. And you've got a month or two to build this forecast for Facebook. You can do a pretty good forecast. So what I would actually do is I would go country by country by country and see how many Facebook users in each country. If it's India, pretty important. India is going to be the biggest country in the world. It's passing up China as far as population. It has some bandwidth, serious issues with bandwidth, but it's improving. It would be a pretty good Facebook customer. I would be doing India all by itself. I might do Africa all as one group. I might do Europe all as one group, or I might do individual countries. So I'm going to focus a lot on this. I might even do revenue per user by country as well. Right? So that gets back to what I was kind of criticizing the accountants of. On this revenue forecast, more detail probably would be more valuable to me. And I would want to know. Now, the other forecast I have is Costco. With Costco, what we did was number of stores and then revenue per store. Y'all remember that, revenue per store? And then I can just read, Costco tells you how many stores they add a year on average. I can look at that historically and I can forecast that out. But the other thing I do with Costco is I can look at how many Costco stores there are in Texas per million population. And I can go look at other states that they aren't as heavy in, like California, and say, what if California had the same number of stores per million population as they do in Texas? And I can have that growth rate. Because I can't just keep adding 100 stores every year, because they can't, in 20 years, they can't have a store on every corner. It's a pretty big store. There's no limit. How many stores can they have in San Antonio? You're going to, at some point, just hit your limit and not be able to add more. So that's the other thing I'd want to do, is I want to broaden out the entire United States and make sure I don't have more. And I actually have over here some numbers. I think I figured it out. No, I don't have it here. I did have some numbers on stores per state per population that I can look at and try to see which states are they saturated in, which states could they add more volume to. So in real life, when you're sitting there to me, it's pretty exciting. You're sitting there 50 hours a week, you can do some pretty amazing stuff. All right. That's the big difference between work and college. In college, you're so high level. It's nothing you do in college is going to be all that impressive, mainly because you don't have enough time. Are y'all spending 50 hours a week on your classes in college? Probably not, right? You just can't do what you can do on the job. It's exciting to be able to do that, but you're somewhat limited. So on Facebook, that's how we got the revenue forecast. Past that, the cost of goods sold, we just did that as percentage of revenues. We use 15%. Why? Because that's what it averaged the last few years. There's selling expenses, there's G&A, what we did there. So we looked at them as percentage of revenue. We looked at them percentage of other things to try to see what would, maybe G&A work better as percentage of cost of goods sold. Who knows? It probably didn't make much difference here. So here we did them as percentage of revenue. You look at G&A as percentage of revenue, it's come down quite a bit, but it's been pretty stable the last few years. So we just took that out. So you're looking at two things. You're looking at the historical relationship. You don't want to just take the average of the history, because the history is so different. It was 27%, now it's only 19%, 18%. So, you're going to take that in consideration. Obviously, Meta looks a lot different 5 years ago than it did in that current year. So you do each of these all the way down to try to get some sense of what the future might look like. But if your revenue forecast is wrong, everything else is horrible. It's just going to be a terrible forecast. Now, I had their net income at 45 billion. Boy, I don't want to even look. Net income 23 billion. I missed that by a wide margin. I'm way off on that. But look at my 2021, 37 billion. Look at that. Boy, I was almost right on. So 2021 was great. I just missed the fact that they were going to fall apart and, go into virtual reality and it not work out. So this is the kind of thing you're doing when you're forecasting, is you're going to start off with that revenue, and then everything else is going to be based off of that. When you do the balance sheet, what I do on the balance sheet is I take every item on the balance sheet and I run regressions against income statement items. So some of them are pretty obvious. My accounts receivable, I'm going to do that as a percentage of revenues. It just makes perfect sense to do that. Accounts payable, I'll probably do that as percent cost of goods sold. But what I do is I run regression. So I'll say, hey, is accounts payable more related to cost of goods sold, or is it more related to selling and administrative expenses? I'll do that type, and based on that, I'll look through it. Property, plant, and equipment for Costco, if I add 100 stores, that's how much property, plant, and equipment is going to go up. It's going to be related to that. So you just go line by line by line, and you try to figure out what is that line in inventory. To me, inventory is going to be a percentage of cost of goods sold. That to me is just really obvious that I'm going to do that all the way throughout. So, some of these are more obvious than others. And there are some things that are plug figures. So probably the most important plug figure is your debt. Your debt makes up for your cash flow shortfalls, so you can use debt to make that up. So some of these you have to do them last. Same thing with equity. So there's some things that are really tough to forecast. You just leave them to the end, but you build everything you can build. Yep. Do we want to look at Costco? Here's my Costco forecast for 2022. Or let's do 2023, 193 billion. They don't have 2023 yet, but 227 billion. Oh, wow, I'm way off. I don't know why I'm way off so much. So we obviously messed up on that forecast. I don't know when I did the forecast. I think it was after COVID. And we actually had it coming down after COVID. I don't think they actually dropped after COVID. So yeah, I mean, they jumped in COVID, and look at that, they jumped again. And that's where we messed up. They jumped in COVID and we had them coming back down higher than 2020, but below 2021, and completely missed that. They kept going up after COVID. Obviously a horrible forecast, but I really don't know that much about Costco to be able to forecast them well. So it's pretty tough. I'm hoping this is exciting if you're accounting. This gets exciting if you're accounting or finance major. This is your job. You're sitting in Excel and you're going into such nitty-gritty details because you want to build something that's quite spectacular. I love this about my job. Some of you might say that sounds really boring. If you're saying that, hopefully you're a cybersecurity major, not a finance major, because this is what finance people do. You get into this nitty-gritty to try to come up with the best. And we do a lot of forecasting. We try to figure out what's the best way to forecast. The other thing you can do here is Bloomberg has forecasts. So if you go on the Bloomberg machine and type EE, you can find a forecast for a company. So we did that with Costco, and boy, did we get it wrong. I was looking at Costco and said, there's no way their revenues are going to keep going up like that. And sure enough, they did. So the Bloomberg forecasters were a lot better forecasters than I was. So your forecasts, you need to be well integrated with your assumptions. I'm going to require sensitivity analysis on your CBAs. You have a forecast in your Walmart file that you did for paper one, so you could actually use that. I would recommend you push your firm towards stochastic modeling, that you actually do simulation. You can see, maybe Thursday I'll show you my March Madness forecast if I remember it. You can do a fairly sophisticated job in Excel. Excel with its random number generator. You can do some pretty powerful stuff. It's pretty impressive. All right. Questions on forecasting. If you're finance or accounting, make sure you do a forecasting class before you graduate. I think the modeling class here does forecasting, but somewhere, if you've never done a forecast, make sure you do one. If you're not finance or accounting, I would still do it. Be able to do a forecast in Excel, pretty important. All right, where to go from here? Next thing we're gonna do is WACC. Weighted average cost of capital. We're gonna spend quite a bit of time on this. You do a WACC in your cost benefit analysis, but I'm not asking you to actually do what we're doing here. So you're just gonna come up with a number for that, for that. All right, so I should be starting to hear from teams the next few days, couple of weeks. I should be hearing from y'all the setup time. There's an official time to set up to show me your base case, but you can set up time before that if you want to touch base and see if you're on the right track. That would be fine as well. All right. All right. So we put time in there. In time, you're going to start off 365.25 divided by 2. Then you just add 365.25. Then you get the years in there. Someone was asking me, what if we're off a day? I don't care. I usually make it so it's exactly the 5th every year, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's going to be pennies difference, but the chances that it's going to be material to your analysis is pretty remote. Then we're going to have our cash flows. And then it's pretty simple. The first two, net present value, just equal X NPV. Did y'all use the X NPV? And you have the rate, you have the values, and you have the dates. Anybody get that number? Does that look familiar? 13,000. And then the IRR, X IRR, your values, and the dates. You can somewhat estimate that by putting the IR in, which putting the IR into the rate, and it should give you, oh, come on. Should give you an NPV of 0 if you just want to somewhat test. And then the last one's the payback. That's the hardest one, but you don't have to use the formulas if you don't want to. So you need a cumulative net present value. So you start off times 0 at negative. And then you take X NPV, that and that. I'm sorry, rate. The first two and the dates. So your net present value at the end of the period is that, but you have to lock these in. And you copy that down. That very last one better be 13,223 if I did it correctly. So obviously I did something wrong. Probably didn't lock in the discount rate. So lock that in, but you'll tell, you'll be able to tell. And that looks good, right? Your net present value should be the same there. And then each year, NPV, so that minus that. So that's how much you add each year. And then you do the percent year used. And here's where on the exam, you're perfectly welcome to say, okay, that's still negative. So you used all of that year. That's still negative. So you used all of that year. Here you started with the deficit of 53,000. You added 66 during a year. So how far into the year did you go? Pretty far, right? You needed 53,000. You only had 66. So you do 53,000 divided by 66. Did anybody get, I'm going to guess none of y'all got 2.8 because you're still learning this, but did anybody get 2.8? Did y'all? Uh-huh. You can add 183 or either's fine. Yeah. You'll get a slightly different answer, but that's fine. Oh, sorry. You didn't get 13, 186, 27.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna be off by a couple of dollars, but that's not material. It'd be material if it were $3, but the chances your net present value be right at 0 is pretty low. It affects your IRR as well. All right, so then you get 2.8. So except because it's greater. So this, yeah, you see the Y, okay, this is important. A lot of students forget this last part. Do you recommend the project and why? So here, according to net present value, except why? Because it's greater than 0. Here, except because it's greater than 4.8%. And here, reject because it's greater than 2.5. Right, so you just put those into your answer, and that will get you that full credit on the Y. Now, overall, do you accept it? You're 2 out of 3. You know, I don't really care on that. The main thing I'm looking for is that you understand accept, reject on that one. That's the main thing I'm looking for. Remember, for your team cases, you're not going to have a payback target. Those doing real estate, the payback doesn't even really work. But all right. Okay, good. All right, so let's talk about that 4.8% you just used. Where did that come from? So cost of capital, extremely important concept in finance. You'll see pieces of this discussion referred to as the most important number in investing, the most important number in finance. We'll talk about those numbers. Extremely important number. If I were you, if you're doing an intern, I would ask, does your firm have a weighted average cost of capital? Can I go talk to the person who calculated it? I would go see how they do it. It's really insightful to do it. UTSA is one guy that does it. Forget his name, last name Bishop. But it's a pretty interesting calculation. It tells you a lot about the firm, gives you a lot of insight on the firm. So let's look at this. So every firm is going to have a cost of capital. Even the US government probably has a cost of capital. And what we're saying with the cost of capital is it's also known, there's a lot of terms, it's also known as the hurdle rate, required return. There's a lot of different terms that we use for it. But the weighted average cost of capital is essentially the return you need to make your investors happy, whether they're bond investors or stock investors. It's what you need. Why is it called weighted average? Because some of them are stock investors, some of them are bond investors, but on average, this is what's required. Stock investors may need a 10% return, bond investors may need a 6% return, but you take the average of those two. And it gets back to this time value money we talked about earlier. Why do we discount cash flows at a discount rate? It's because first, there's an inflationary aspect to it. A dollar's worth more today than it's probably going to be worth in the future. There's an opportunity cost that if you get the dollar today, you could invest it and have more dollars in the future versus if you wait until the future. There's risk. If you get the dollar today, you got it. If you wait until the future, that dollar may not be there. We're right now seeing the US government debating the debt ceiling. So they're saying, hey, we may not pay off our debt. That would be pretty devastating to the entire world economy if that happened. They talked about that last night in the Investment Society. And in human nature, people just prefer to do stuff now than have to wait for a year. So the discount rate really focuses in on the second and third one. The second one, the opportunity cost, includes compensating you for inflation. That 10-year treasury yield is your opportunity cost, plus it should cover inflation. Now we realize the US treasury yield for several years there was below inflation. So you're actually getting what we call a real yield that was negative. Very, very important you're comfortable with these terms. What do I mean by CPI? Consumer Price Index, have y'all heard that before? So if I were you, I would go out there and map it. CPI, Fred. It's pretty easy to get. Let's do seasonally adjusted. And then I like to do year over year change, especially here recently. Does it look like inflation's coming down? That looks pretty good, doesn't it? It is coming down. This is where I went to college. This is where I graduated from high school. Inflation was pretty high. I can remember back then people were like, I think gas prices hit, was it $1 or $2? I can't remember, but it was somewhere around there. It might have been $2. But like, we can't travel if gas is $2. No one's going to buy gas at $2. But inflation was pretty high back then. It actually went negative during the Great Crisis, where things were cheaper a year later. We got pretty close to zero here, pretty close to zero during the pandemic. And then when the government spent all that money, a lot of those distributions and then the supply chain and all that shut up, but it is coming back down. So that's pretty good. And you can do this, you know, if you want to look at some of the crazy numbers, use car price inflation. You know, you can get pretty, I'm not sure how easy it is to find that. Yeah, yeah, this is pretty radical stuff. I've never been in a position where I bought a used car. I bought a used car right at the end of 2019. I've never had a case where I bought a used car and I could sell it for like a 20% gain a year later. That's just first time ever. But you see used car prices just shot up and now they're coming back down again. That's one of the reasons that inflation numbers come down, right? Oil prices, car prices, real estate prices, those kind of things. So that's inflation. What does inflation do? It weakens the value of a dollar, what it can buy. So if inflation is 2%, the real rate of interest is 2%, then the nominal rate is 4%. And that's what the US Treasury yield is supposed to be giving you, is a real rate of interest plus inflation, so you get a nominal. So the 10-year Treasury yield is a nominal rate. What's the real yield? Well, the real yield is the tip. I don't know if we can download it in here somewhere. Yeah, they're not letting me download it, but there's a place we can download it. But you'll notice, I don't want to bring it in now, but you'll notice that the real yield was actually not just negative, but significantly negative, especially 2020, 2021. So essentially, I don't know, anybody know the history on the absolute low on the 10-year Treasury? It hit it in 2020. I was pretty shocked when it did. I put out a Facebook post that's like, the bond market's going crazy. But yeah, it hit 0.5%. That's your nominal yield. So that's your opportunity plus your inflation. Does 0.5% cover your inflation? Obviously not, because inflation shot up to 8%. So that's the lowest during your lifetime, during your college career. 10-year Treasury hit its all-time low out of the last 200 and something years. So the real yield can actually be negative. It's quite positive now. It's come back up, but it can be negative. The real yield is essentially the TIPS yield, because the tip yield is the inflation-linked Treasury, which pays you a real yield plus inflation. So the real yield is actually stated. We know what the real yield is. And so we can cover inflation by just using the 10-year Treasury yield, because that's a nominal yield. It should include inflation in it. So our big focus is, how do we adjust for risk? This opportunity cost, including inflation, we're just going to use treasuries for that. So that's going to be pretty simple. We can go out and get treasury yields anytime. I think I can even show you this. So you do treasury yield curve. You can actually bring it up. It's a nice, pretty graph. So there it is today. But if you go back to the recession, looks a lot different, doesn't it? The 10-year, I don't know exactly when it hit its low. It's at 0.92 there. Forget exactly where it hit. This goes day by day. It's coming down, coming down. Looks very different back then than it does today. Notice how steep it is how steep it was back then versus today. It's what is this called? Starts with an I. Inverted. It's the inverted yield curve. Yeah, so it's inverted. What does an inverted yield curve tell you is going to happen? That's part of it. An inverted yield curve tells you that they expect longer term rates to fall. But usually what an inverted yield curve is telling you is recession's around the corner, usually within 6 months or so. We've never had a recession in US history without an inverted yield curve. We have had a couple of inverted yield curves without recessions. I kind of talked about this last night, but the inverted yield curve has, I think, predicted 13 of the last 11 recessions. So we've had a couple of inverted yield curves where we didn't get a recession, but very, very, very inverted too. It's not just like it's slightly inverted, it's quite significantly inverted. And why is that? Because the Fed's raising rates And the bond market's telling us they're going to go too far. We're going to have a bad recession. And so they're going to have to cut this part of the yield curve. And this yield curve may not be saying rates are going to fall on the long end, but it's definitely telling you that rates are going to fall on the short end. The Fed's going to have to cut rates here within the next few months. So that's the steep yield curve. And this is pretty cool. You can bring this in. If you look at today, 4.6, because the long end has absolutely just shrunk here recently. Just a couple of days ago, we're down to 4.2%. I mean, it's pretty, 3.2%. Bonds are definitely rallying right now. And then human nature is just captured in all of that. Human nature is captured in opportunity cost. If people prefer to spend today rather than save, then the U.S. government's got to pay more interest because there'll be less demand for their bonds and they'll have to reduce their prices. So we can really capture everything in opportunity cost and risk. So our discount rate is the risk-free rate, which includes inflation and the real rate of interest plus the risk premium. And the risk premium is where we really have to do our work in this part of the analysis. So we're looking for the appropriate discount rate, the discounted cash flow. All right, we talked about that. So how do we do this for bonds? We look at bond ratings. Generally, I'm going to show you some bond ratings. I updated my spreadsheet here pretty recently, so let's see if we can just look at that. I did it just a couple weeks ago, a few days ago. If you're a finance major, you can get these spreads out of Bloomberg. That looks intimidating, doesn't it? But that's the Bloomberg ticker for a particular type of bond. So if AAA, is that high quality or low quality? About as high as you can get, or it is as high as you can get. Then AA, single A, these we call high quality. Triple B is medium quality, and then high yield are junk bonds. Do you call them junk bonds, or do you call them high yield or below investment grade? What if you run a high yield bond fund? What do you call it? You're going to call it the Fidelity Junk Bond Fund? Probably not. The Fidelity Below Investment Grade Fund? No, you're going to call it the Fidelity High Yield Fund. USA has the USA High Income Fund. Why did they call it High Income Fund, not High Yield Fund? Yeah, actually the reason, I like high income better, but the reason they did that is in 2008, Matt, who was running that fund, he found some triple B bonds that had better yields than the high yield bonds, and he wanted to buy them. But his bond fund was called the USA High Yield Fund, and regulations wouldn't let him buy triple B bonds because he's a high yield bond manager. And he got so mad. It's like, give me a break. I've got a bond that's higher quality with a better yield than a high yield bond, and I can't buy it because of the name of my fund. So USA spent $300 and something thousand to change the name of his bond fund from high yield to high incomes, just so he could buy any bond he wanted to. So yeah, there's a lot of these terms mean a lot. So historically, here's the spread. Now this is the spread. That 0.3 is known as 30 basis points. So we're going to get used to that. You did some of that, didn't you, when you did the bond? Some of y'all done, well, I don't know how many of y'all done the bond application, but you'll get that. So 30 basis points. So if the treasury is at 4%, what would 30 basis points give you? Is it 7%, 4.3%, or 4.03%? What is 30 basis points? 4.3, right? So it's 0.3, so you add that. So 84 basis points, that would mean 4.84%. 121 basis points, so that would be 5.21%. Triple B, 179, so that'd be 5.79%. And in high yield would be 8.95%. That's the average. These are the medians. And why do we do medians and averages? Your stat class already talked about that, but if you have a distribution that's somewhat skewed to the left or the right, the median will reflect that. If they're not skewed, if it's nice and symmetrical, the average and the median will be about the same. Well, higher yield, but you're not going to make 8.95 because a lot of them are going to default. On average, about 20% of those bonds are going to default. So you're going to lose, 200 basis point. Well, over 10 years, 20% over 10 years, that's 2% a year. You're going to lose about 2% a year just because the bonds won't mature. It's still a pretty good yield, but is it better than this? You probably will make more money on them, but it's going to be a lot more volatile. If we have a recession, these bonds may actually go up in value. These bonds could fall 20, 30%. So in 2008, these bonds were down 30, 40%, along with the stock market. In 2009, when the stock market was up 70%, they were up 70%. Well, if defaults, so like when Enron defaulted, the stockholders lost 100%. The bondholders might have gotten 20 cents on the dollar back. So if you loaned them $1 million, you might get $200,000 back. The average recovery, that's called recovery. The average recovery for AAA is 40 to 50%. So, well, you can sell the bond. So if you have a bond that doesn't mature yet, you can sell it to somebody else, but they're going to look at the probability of default, and that's how our discount rate is going to come. If they think the probability of default is really low, they're going to give you a really small spread, like 30 basis points. If they think it's really high, they're going to demand 500 basis points. Who's right, who's wrong? If you think, hey, there's not much chance this thing's going to default, you're probably just going to keep it. Because I think that they think there's a high chance, they're going to use a really high discount rate and give you a really low price. Right? So these things can fall quite dramatically. In 2008, I was on a committee where we had to meet anytime a bond price fell more than, I think, 20%. My first few years in that committee, we never met. In 2008, we're meeting every week, especially in the last quarter. We didn't have bonds that were falling 20%. We had bonds that were falling 80%. And they weren't high yield bonds. We had single A and triple B bonds falling 80%. So yeah, it was a horrible, and I was a stock guy. So I was like just sitting there letting them debate what they're going to do. It was whatever they decided. I voted because I was just there to vote. They didn't care what I thought because I wasn't the bond guy. I was the stock guy. So yeah, 2008 was a pretty rough year. And that's why I have it in here for 2008. Look at what high yields were. That's what you're adding on top of treasuries. So 18%. I was buying high yields then because they were so cheap. So I buy high yields and they were up 70% in 2009. Now I bought them at the end of the year. After that, they already fallen like 80, 90%. And then the next year they're up a bunch. So yeah, I was getting these massive yields. So yeah, 10, 20% of them might default. So that's, you're going to lose 1 or 2% a year, but you're making 20 something percent. So you're still going to make a really high return. Yeah, it's a great investment. But look at AAA. AAA, we're paying 157 basis points in 2008. That's a really good return. So, yeah. So now the low was back just a couple years ago. Look at high yield. They're only paying 268 basis points. I remember in 2021, I was thinking, who's buying high yield? That's just not, you're going to lose most of that to defaults. So who's buying these bonds? So that's the history. I encourage my finance students to print that part out and just carry it in their wallet. So just know what the typical spread is for these bonds, because it's helpful to know, especially if you're interviewing. Brian's working for Victory Capital this summer, right? He needs to know these spreads because that's how they talk. They talk in spreads. So most bonds have a market.
Because I know that I think SBB, that was one big problem.
Well, you can sell almost any bond. There are some savings bonds, the U.S. government, that are only in bearer names, so you can't transfer them. They're really bizarre bonds. I don't know anything about them because they're so small. But yeah, there's more. You can sell your bank CD if you want to. You know, there's no reason you can't sell something that you own, but there are some markets that are liquid and some that are illiquid. So there may not be a viable market out there that you can actually find. But yeah, if you have something that has a cash flow, you can sell it to somebody else and they can take it from you, just like real estate or anything else. So here's the history of it. If you graph the history, 2008 really, really stands out. You just see it as an unusual period of time. I mean, can you tell where 2008 was? There it is right there. So 2008 stands out as one of the worst bond markets. Treasuries did great, but this is not treasuries. This is corporate bonds. They did really badly. I actually compared that in 2008, how corporates were down like 15, 20%, but treasuries are up 15, 20%. And that difference between corporates and treasuries, I was curious, when's the last time we saw that difference? And I was thinking the Great Depression, but I had to tell the bond guys, 2008 is even worse than the Great Depression. And they're like, oh, thanks. We weren't really, I felt sorry for those guys. There's one guy named John I worked with, and I would just tell people, you see John in the hall, give him a hug, because it was just a horrible, horrible year for them. They've never seen anything that bad before. So that's what we're going to do in bonds. It's going to be heavily related on bond ratings. So the lower the quality, the more spread you're going to get, the more basis points you're going to get. And the more basis points and more spread, the higher the discount rate, which means that's going to make the price of the bond lower. The higher discount rate, the lower the price today. We already know basis points. It sounds like you are getting that. So the cost of debt, y'all saw that in your when you're doing the application on valuing bonds. So the key with bonds is that they're tax deductible. And so when you borrow money as a corporation, your advantage of borrowing money over issuing stock is that when you pay interest on your debt, that's tax deductible. So the US taxpayer essentially subsidizes borrowing money, but they don't subsidize equity. So our KD, anybody know what KD means? I have it up here. KD is cost of debt. Why do we use K and not C? I don't know. But we've always used K. We can't spell, I guess, but it's K. I think the C must mean something else. But KD, cost of debt. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip stocks, and I want to go to the final formula because I want you to see where we're going. I want you to see the final formula. Here's the credit ratings. Y'all saw this when you did your first project. I like S&P, extremely strong, very strong. I'm sorry, extremely strong, very strong, strong, then adequate. That doesn't sound good, but adequate. And then when you get down below that, you start seeing words of, start seeing risk. These firms are in trouble. So we're going to skip equity and come back because that's the hard part. But I want to show you the final formula. So this is what we're after right here. Oops. Right? Should you memorize this formula? No, you should just know this formula. This is one of those formulas you should just know no matter what you make. This is just such a critical formula in finance. Everybody knows this formula. Now in this class, I've simplified it. In the other class, they go crazy on stuff I think is incredibly unimportant, but I do want to warn you about it. They talk about issuance costs, and they talk about preferred stock. Those to me, that's overkill. And what they mean with issuance stocks is when you have debt outstanding, it has a cost. But if you issue debt for the first time, it's going to cost you a little bit more because you got to hire an investment banker, you got to go out to the market, you got to do all this. So it costs you a little bit more. That to me is incredibly unimportant. I don't think that's important. I don't think they asked that on the fact exam. They might ask preferred stock. Preferred stock's pretty simple. You just plug it into the formula, just like everything else. It's not tax deductible, so it works. So I don't cover these two things. So the WACC has these pieces. So when you're doing your application, you essentially have to find each of these pieces. So let's look at them. We got a KD, we got a tax rate, we have a weight of debt, we have a KE, we have a weight of equity. Right, there's your KD. I just showed you that formula. It's the risk-free rate plus the spread. And y'all did that when you priced the bonds. Y'all have seen that one already. The tax rate is just given, but it's always the marginal, not the effective tax rate. Right, so I'll give you a hint on the fact exam or any other exam. If you're given a marginal and effective tax rate, 98% of the time you need to use the marginal rate. All right, I can't think of a situation where it's effective, but there may be a case where it's effective, but most of the time you want the marginal rate. All right, the weight of debt. And the weight of equity. Pretty straightforward. You do the dollar in debt divided by the dollar in debt plus the dollar in equity. So if you have $1 billion in debt and you have $1 billion in debt and $2 billion in equity, then 1 divided by 3, you have 1/3 of your capital is coming from debt. All right, and equity is going to be the exact same thing, but the dollar in equity divided by the dollar in debt is the dollar in equity. And what do you know for sure? The weight of debt plus the weight of equity is going to equal what? One, just yell it out. What do you say? 1. Okay. I thought you said a lot. Okay. All right, 100%. All right, so you just need to know that's the case, because if you're confident in the weight of debt and it's 20%, then you can just plug in 80% for equity. You don't necessarily have to go calculate it, but that's it. I give you the dollar in debt. I give you the dollar amount in equity. The other thing I ignore is whether debt, dollar in debt, dollar in equity, or book value or market value. Theory says market value. But we're going to ignore that. All right. So be ready that you finance majors, when you take Dr. Katapackham's class, he's going to make a big deal out of that because it is really, really important. And why is it important? Well, let me just show you why it's important. Let's take a firm like, I'm going to guess Trump's picture is going to be on Yahoo Finance. Oh, I was wrong. DeSantis, they're competing. So, let's look at Amazon. And Amazon has a statistic called price to book. What price to book means is the market value of the firm to what the accountants say the firm is worth. The accountants say they're conservative, so you would think the accounting value would be less than the market value. Look at for Amazon. Their market value is 7 times larger than their book value. So does it make a difference whether you use the market value of equity or the book value of equity? Yeah, it makes a huge difference. I'm ignoring that. On the exam, I only give you one number, so it's not like I'm going to give you book value, market value. You got to know to take market value, but just know that we use market value. That's not so difficult. What's difficult is getting the market value of debt. That can be really, really, really tough. And that's one reason why a lot of people just use book values. Market value debt, where do you get that? You can get it from Bloomberg. The Bloomberg machines will have that. The problem is, let me give you USAA. USAA has debt, but they also have CDs. They also have annuities. They have reserves. So when USA borrows money, they borrow money in the market, but they also issue certificates of deposit. That's borrowing money. They also have annuities in their life insurance company. They have reserves. USA counts all of those as part of their cost of debt. But they do all of that on a book value basis. They don't go mark this certificates of deposit to market. So that's why it gets so complicated. So that's why I say, any of y'all have an intern at USA? the annual, what's your major? I can't remember. You're finding out great. In this summer? Oh man, you should call me. You should go and ask them for this. I don't know who their CFO is right now. It used to be Laura Bishop, but she might have retired. USAA CFO. Jeff Wallace. Ah man, I don't know Jeff Wallace. Sorry. Okay, boy. I knew Laura Bishop really, really well. And I even went to lunch with her son to give him advice on finance. So I'm like trying to keep my, so I can call her anytime, but she retired, unfortunately. So I don't know Jeff Wallace. I should just introduce him. I do know Brett Seabolt, and that's a person you want to know. Oh, and I don't know how to spell his name. There he is, Seabolt. So memorize his name, Seabolt. Have you met him? Yeah, impressive person, right? You talk about, he worked for me for like 3 months, and he started his career with me right at the beginning. And a great opportunity came up, and he was a great employee. I didn't want to lose him, but I said, you got to take that job. And he moved up so fast at USAA. He was like a senior VP, probably faster than anyone else at USAA. So yeah, I do have a connection with him. So yeah, if you want to go introduce him, he's a really, really nice guy. He's not, I mean, look, he's got his jacket over his shoulder, he's friendly and laid back. So yeah, that's something, Emmanuel, you're going to understand USA much better if you say, hey, show me the weighted average cost of capital calculation. And Brett Seabolt could show you that. So it gets complicated. So if you look at USAA, their spreadsheet that does this is massive. It's like 80 sheets deep, not because of the cost of equity. Cost of equity is a piece of cake. That's like one little number in this massive spreadsheet, but it's all these CDs and reserves and everything else that they have to bring in. So it can get pretty complicated. So they should be, and Emmanuel, don't tell them this, but they should be using market values, but they don't. They're going to use book value because it's just too complicated. So I'm ignoring some stuff you're supposed to know that I'm ignoring because most of you aren't finance majors, but you will see this if you're a finance major. So be ready for it. All right, so there's the weights. The weights should be market value. We're not worrying about that. So we got that. Cost of debt. You've already handled that when you priced your bonds. So you already got some practice with that. Y'all remember doing that? Anybody done that project yet? That problem yet? We did it in class. Yeah, I remember doing it in class, getting the discount rate and adding it in. We'll do that as our team case next week. The tax rate's given, weighted debt's given. What's the one thing we're missing? Cost of equity. And here we can use the capital asset pricing model, which says that's cap M. Who created cap M? Anybody know? William Sharp. That name sound familiar? So if you're a finance major, not knowing William Sharp is like being a physics major and never have heard of Einstein. If you had a friend who was a physics major, hey, what do you think about Albert Einstein? I never heard that name before. Is he a rapper or a singer or something? No, you'd be pretty shocked, right? So finance majors know who William Sharp is. He's still alive. He's a Nobel Prize winner. And what he said, the discount rate for equity is the risk-free rate, just like with bonds, plus something called the market risk premium times something called beta. Not a difficult formula, pretty simple formula. Maybe the single most famous formula in the entirety of finance. There was someone did analysis on William Sharp's doctoral paper from the 60s. And they said that was the most referenced doctoral paper ever in the history of finance. And they don't know how many times it was referenced because they stopped counting. It just got too ridiculous. So that means we need a few more things. So here we need the risk-free rate. But is the risk-free rate there the same as the risk-free rate here? And the answer is no. So the risk-free rate is going to be a treasury with the same maturity as firm's debt. So if the firm's debt is on average 5 years, you use a 5-year treasury, right? So that is pretty simple. Right, so this problem really is a case of filling in the blanks. So you need, for KD, you need these. You need a spread. You get it from the table, matching, rating, and maturity. So if I say 5-year debt and triple B bond, you go find the triple B, find the 5 years, and that tells you the spread. All right. You did that in application 4 or 5, or I think 5. All right. So that gets you everything you need for KD. All of that's given. You just got to know which number to pull. And you'll see when you do the exercise, it's pretty straightforward. The tax rate's is given. The weighted debt, the dollar in debt, the dollar in equity is given. So there's no calculation there. You just pull the number. So the last thing we need are these numbers. So we need a risk-free rate here. And here you could actually Google it. You could say, which risk-free rate for CAPM? Let's see how many things come up. 4 million results. Or you can say, which treasury rate for CAPM? 10 million sites come up. So this is a debate. So you're buying a stock. You want the risk-free rate. What is risk-free? Is it the 1-month treasury, the 3-month treasury, the 5-year treasury, the 10-year treasury? And the answer is yes, it's one of those. So which one is it? So we're going to go with tradition, uses the 10-year treasury. Why the 10-year? So you can read articles on that, but the 10-year. One thing you'll notice on Yahoo Finance. Sorry. They just added this thing. It irritates me. It's just like ESPN does that. Just irritates the life out of me. There should be a law against that. All right. So you'll notice Yahoo Finance has the S&P, the Dow, the NASDAQ, Russell. They only have one interest rate. What interest rate is that? If I go right here, what's the only interest rate on this website? The 10-year treasury. It's the only one. It's the most important treasury. It prices a lot of securities. It's the most used for pricing stocks. Is the 10-year really risk-free? Well, the 10-year treasury fell about, I don't know, 18, 19% last year because interest rates rose. But it's considered, if you have a 10-year horizon and you invest in a 10-year, you're pretty sure what you're going to get unless the government goes default. And it's hard for the government to go default since they can print money, even though the Republicans are abating the debt ceiling right now. We generally think of the 10-year treasury. It has the right horizon for a stock investor. Some people might say, what about the 30-year treasury? Because you're a stock investor, you're a long-term investor. The problem with the 30-year treasury is that it's a very specific market. There's very specific investors in that market. So there's a supply and demand thing there, and very few people use a 30-year treasury, and that's a very, very, very specific market. The 30-year can do really weird things. So the 10-year is the most common rate. So we're going to use the 10-year. Just be aware, not everybody uses the 10-year. Now, on the fact exam, they'll make it really clear. If you take the fact exam, which treasury to use. So they're not going to say, hey, should you use 5 or the 10-year? Because that's not a legitimate question. Because you can argue for the 5-year, you can argue for the 10-year, you can argue for the 3-month. All of those are legitimate. The market risk premium. This one is often referred to as the most important number in finance or in investing. I can show you articles that refer to that one number as the most important number in finance. One of the people on my team went to a market risk premium conference, several-day conference, and they presented over 1,000 papers on the market risk premium. He brought them all back on a big disc. 1,000 papers, reread like 4 of them because most of them were completely unreadable. They were so mathematical, just ridiculous papers. I might show you probably the most famous of the papers that came out of that conference. There's one that really helped. But we'll have to talk about that. We're going to talk about this number. But it's essentially it's the risk premium needed by the average diversified investor in stocks. So how much over treasuries do you need to make to get you into the stock market? All right. And then beta, we're going to talk quite a bit about beta. Now, when you get to your Excel application, I can't remember which one, but there's one where you're going to spend your entire time coming up with this this KE, and you're going to spend most of your time just on beta, because beta is pretty rough. You're going to see how when you do this application, you're going to have to do all the work and get all the numbers. On the exam, I give you all the numbers. You just got to remember how to do the steps. All right. So I'm going to use a 4-step process. Forecast this number. Which means on the exam too, you're all going to have different answers because you're all going to have different betas. You're going to have to come up with your own beta, but there's going to be right answers, multiple right answers, and there are wrong answers. There's times where you do it incorrectly. Like if you give me a beta of 3.6 for Walmart, I know you're going to just know it's wrong. And we'll talk about why that's the case. All right. So this is where we're going. And this is what the Excel application does. It gives you all these numbers and you just got to plug them into the formula, but you got to know what number to use. And then you have an Excel application where you're going to focus your attention just coming up with the beta. And then on the exam, I'll give you that information to do that. All right. So it really is a filling in the blanks. All right, here's the WACC. So just to show you how it works, if I were you on this in Excel, I would put all the pieces. So everything you need the risk-free rate, you might say the bond risk-free rate. So you need one thing there. You want to have a separate line for that. You want the spread. You want to have a cell for the tax rate. You want to have a cell for weight of debt, a cell for weight of equity. You want to have the stock risk-free rate. You want to have a separate cell for that. You want to have a cell for the market risk premium. That's just a given. I just give you that. And then the beta, you're going to have a cell for that. And then you're going to have a cell that's just going to do the formula. And that formula is pretty simple, pretty easy to do. On the exam too, you have to know this formula because it's not that difficult a formula to learn. So you'll just have that in the Excel. So when you're doing the Excel, plug all those in. So the risk-free rate. So let's see if we can just figure out, I don't know how far we can get on this. Kroger is a full-service grocery store. They have bonds maturing in 7 years. That's their average bond. What's your risk-free rate for bonds? Just yell it out. It's not a trick question, so just yell it out. Is it 1.5% to 3.25%? 3.6%. Pretty straightforward, isn't it? What's the risk-free rate for stocks? What did I say you use for stocks? 10-year treasuries, or what's the risk-free rate for stocks? 4.1. So we got our two risk-free rates. So you just plug them out. So you got two of your numbers. We need our spread, 7-year bond. And what is it rated? AA. So 7 years in AA. Can you yell that one out? 80. Is this a hard question? It's a pretty easy question. Why do students mess up on this one? They forget, after they do problem 1, they forget to change everything for problem 2. So go back and make sure you change your spread, change every number. So make sure you you have everyone set up. So our spread there is 80. You can type it as 80, or if you want to, you can type it as 80 divided by 10,000. So to go from spread, and go from basis points into a rate, you can divide by 10,000. And so what is your KD going to be? KD is the risk-free rate plus your spread. So risk-free rate is 3.6 plus your spread, 4.4%. Now, if you want to, you might keep the equity stuff separate from the bond stuff. So there you got your KD. What's your tax rate? Their marginal tax rate is 25%. I don't give you the effective. It's the only tax rate there. If you give me 37% on the exam, I'm probably going to call you and ask, where did you even get that number? So you don't have many choices there. All right. We need our weight of debt, weight of equity. So what is our weight of debt? So Kroger has $8 billion in debt and $5 billion in equity. That's what net worth is. So what is their weight of debt? 8 divided by 8 plus 5. Everybody agree with that? And then what's your equity? 1 minus that. So I got our two weights. I moved the wrong thing down. I moved that down. I moved this back up. So I got my bonds. Now I just need my stocks. I need a market risk premium and I need a beta. Well, my market risk premium, I just give that to you. I call it equity risk premium. They mean the exact same thing. And I flick between the two of them. Equity risk premium, market risk premium are the exact same thing. That's 4%. So that's easy. So I'm only missing one thing now, and that's beta. So what is my beta? Well, let's see if they tell us their beta. I don't give the beta, so we'll have to get into that next time. We'll have to talk about it. But that's the only thing I do is get beta. Beta is a little bit complex, but Kroger's, you're just going to know after you go through this beta exercise that Kroger's going to have a very low beta because it's a grocery store. We'll talk about why that is. So you only need one number. Let's say we use 0.5 for them. Then all we need to do is do the WACC. The WACC is just going to be the cost of debt times the weight of debt times 1 minus the tax rate plus the cost of equity. I didn't do the cost of equity times the weight of equity. So our cost of equity is going to be the risk-free rate plus the market risk premium times beta. And that gives you, and what I recommend you do is, highlight the numbers you need to change. It's almost every one of them here, but highlight them so you make sure when you go to the second problem, you change everything you're supposed to change, all right? Now this problem on the second exam, you don't get to do this one in Excel because you don't really need to. It's just plugging in numbers. So the time value money and the cost benefit analysis, those you get to do in Excel, but this one you just do on paper. All right, we'll leave it there. You'll see where we're going.